everybody this evening? Good. This is number 3 of Women in American History series. Tonight we're doing Amelia Earhart, and we've got one more in, well, 3 weeks. And that's Eleanor. But tonight is Amelia, who was a friend of Eleanor's. But Amelia Earhart, she is the product of a Samuel Edwin Stanton Earhart and an Amy Otis Earhart. She was born July 27, 1897 in Atchison, Kansas. She will have one sister, Grace Muriel Earhart, who was born in 1899, who did not like being called Grace. She liked being called Muriel. And unlike her sister, Muriel's going to live until 1998. She'll be 99 when she passes. Lived quite a long time. Both girls, interesting, their mother is a fascinating character here in that she didn't really, treat the girls as dainty little girls. They wore bloomers instead of dresses. Very much the outdoor type. Amelia later on will be shooting rats or other vermin with a rifle. The two are constantly like climbing trees. They're out in the wild collecting katydids, worms, whatever. And so they're very curious, courtesy of their mother. Their grandmother, Amy's mother herself, thought, well, no, these girls should be wearing dresses and girls should be ladylike. No. Kind of a forerunner of what's coming down the pike here by their mother. Their father, Samuel, works for the Rock Island Railroad as a claims officer. And you can see where the girls are going here when they visit an uncle in 1904, when Amelia is 7 years old. And their uncle, of course, if you were these girls' mother, you might not be happy about this one. He actually built a ramp off the roof of a tool shed. And Amelia would get in a box, slide down the roof, and off the ramp. And obviously gravity's going to do its work here, folks. The box would hit the ground, pow! And Amelia would yell to her sister, hey, it's just like flying. Yeah. And so, but as by 1910 or by 1907 rather, Edwin is going to be transferred, or Samuel is going to be transferred to Des Moines, Iowa, by the Rock Island Railroad. Still has his job as claims officer, but the family itself will be slow in moving. Amelia and her sister are still going to be living at their grandmother's house. In fact, that's where Amelia was born, in their grandmother's house in Atchison, Kansas. But at one point in 1907, when the girls are in Des Moines, her father takes her to an Iowa State Fair in Des Moines. And this is a chance for Eleanor to fly. When she's 10 years old, her father was, you want to go up? I'll pay and you go up. And she says no. Airplanes weren't an attraction for her at this point. But most of the time, up to about 1910, they're still living, the girls are still living in Atchison, Kansas. And Amelia does not see a school until she's 12 years old, a public school. They are homeschooled by their mother and or a governess. Now keep in mind the grandparents have a few bucks. They have a nice big library. And Amelia was a voracious reader. But for the most part, they are homeschooled. However, once they move to Des Moines, the family now has a house. They get 2 servants. Seems like even their economic stature is picking up here. But keep in mind, Samuel is beginning to drink. And so by 1914, things are beginning to go the other way. Keep in mind here, when Amelia's grandmother dies, she had somewhat of a fortune that she left to Amy, her daughter. And she made sure that it was in her daughter's name only, and not a co-inheritance with her husband Samuel, who was drinking. Didn't want her son-in-law to drink it all up. However, at this time, the parents are beginning to split, and Samuel's going to lose his job with the Rock Island Railroad. He will go for therapy to dry out, and he's going to get a job with the Great Northern Railroad, St. Paul, Minnesota. He will lose that job when the person he takes the place of wants the job back. Amy, in the meantime, is eventually going to take the children and go to Chicago and live with friends there. Keep in mind, Amelia's a high school age at this point. And at this point, when they go to Chicago, 1915, at this juncture, Amy and Amelia will go to various high schools. And when they go to these various high schools, Amy wants a good science program. The first high school they go to, Amy complains, well, you're not going to high school here because the science program here is no bigger than a kitchen sink. She finally ends up in Hyde Park High School to finish out her high school career and education. And she's very much the loner. In fact, that's even put in the yearbook. The girl in brown, always alone. You know, some kids can be cruel, right? You know how that goes. And so by 1917, she's obviously out of school here. She wanted to continue her education, but she doesn't. Instead, she goes to Toronto in 1917. She's 20 years old at this point. She goes to Toronto, and she visits. That's where her sister is. And while she's in Toronto in 1917, she becomes exposed to Canadian soldiers coming home from the Western Front. That's World War I. And she sees these horrific wounds inflicted on these soldiers from industrialized war. And she volunteers to be a Red Cross aide at the Spadina Military Hospital. And she'll be there for the next year. However, keep in mind here, you know, as you get into the fall of 1918, what hits? The Spanish flu? She will not get the Spanish flu. She will get pneumonia and maxillary sinusitis, a severe sinus infection. She'll be in the hospital November into December. The pneumonia she'll beat. The sinus infection, you know, keep in mind, this is an era pre-antibiotics. And so now the tubes are going to have to be put into her head to drain her sinuses. She's going to be afflicted with this for a number of years, even when she's flying. In fact, it's interesting, I couldn't find any, you might, if you really look, maybe you can, photos of her like in pilot's kit with a bandage on her face because of the drainage tubes. That had to happen periodically. And she had terrific headaches to the point where she really couldn't function. An eye, one of her, I think it was her right eye, was in very much pain here. And so after she gets out of the hospital, she will wind up in Northampton, Massachusetts in 1919. And she's living with her sister. She's convalescing for a year. She's doing a lot of reading. She begins to write poetry, begins to research mechanics. You know, she's branching herself out here. And she really wants to go to school. She opts to go to Smith College, changes her mind, and decides she wants to go to Columbia and study medicine. That gets stopped. That's going to be short-circuited. Her mother and father are going to get together, and they're in California. She winds up in Long Beach, California in 1920. And it is here her father, just like he did when she was 10 years old, takes her to a fair. And there's a man by the name of Frank Hawkins, who will be a well-known barnstormer pilot and air racer. $10 to go up. And her father says, well, $10, and why don't you take a ride? So Amelia this time says, yes. That plane is no more than 300 feet off the ground, and now she knows what she wants to do. Fly. This is December 28, 1920. Now this is how determined this young lady is. She takes a job as a stenographer at a phone company. She photography. She is actually into photography, and she's a pretty good photographer, taking pictures for money. She's also driving a truck part-time. Together with her mother, she collects about $1,000. And at the end of January 1921, she contacts Anita Snook, also known as Nita, who will become a famous pilot in her own right. And she's teaching people how to fly. Now this is how determined this young lady is, Amelia Earhart. She will take the bus from her home to the end of the line and then walk 3 or 4 miles on top of that to the airfield. She will learn how to fly. She will buy her own plane, a Kinner Airster. It's a small double-wing plane in yellow, and she nicknames it the Canary. And it's in that plane in October 22nd, 1922, she will set the altitude record for female pilots at 14,000 feet. The following year, May 15, 1923, she is the 16th female pilot to get a license from the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale. She's on her way. You know, keep in mind at this point, the grandmother has already died, and I mentioned this earlier, and Amelia's mother gets the fortune. Well, by this time, the fortune's running out. So Amelia has to sell the Canary. She had also bought another plane. She has to sell that. By this time, the mother and father are separated, they're divorced, and so Amelia, with the proceeds, buys a car. Her and her mother will drive cross-country from California to Massachusetts, with a slight stop at Banff, Alberta. They wind up in Boston. And from here, you know, she wants to go back to college. She wants to go to Columbia. They don't have the money for this. So she winds up being a social worker, a teacher, but keep in mind, her heart is still with flying. She begins to write here articles in local newspapers and magazines about flying. By 1927, she is the first person to fly out of Denison Airport. She's also going to become here a sales rep for Kinster, where she bought her first plane from. In 1927 as well, what does Charles Lindbergh do? Flies the Atlantic, right? Yeah. And so aviation is now being raised on another level in this country. Lucky Lindy flew the Atlantic. And in 1928, Amelia, who's becoming a personality in her own right, gets a phone call. How would you like to fly the Atlantic? She says yes. Only she's not going to fly the plane. Wilmer Stultz will fly the plane. Lewis Gordon will be the co-pilot mechanic. She will keep the flight log. And so in June 1928, they will leave Newfoundland and they will arrive in South Wales in 20 hours and 40 minutes. But of course, she's the first woman to cross the Atlantic. They make a big deal out of this. There's a big parade in England. They come home. There's a big parade in New York. But when she's asked about being the first woman across the Atlantic, for her it's no big deal. She says, I didn't fly the plane. I was ballast. I was baggage. I kept the log. I went for the ride. But that's not the point here. The point here is a woman crossed the Atlantic in an airplane. And so now begins the publicity. And one of those who's a big publicist here is George Palmer Putnam, the well-known publisher of his era. And George Palmer Putnam is one of those really pushing Amelia Earhart here. He was married to a Dorothy Binney. Dorothy Binney was an heiress to the Binney Smith Company, which was a chemical company, the company that invented Crayola crayons. And they had 2 children, George Palmer Jr. and a David Binney Putnam. And Amelia really got to like David. but she's not going to marry David. She's going to marry his father after a while, because George Palmer Putnam's going to divorce his wife. He's going to ask Amelia 6 times to marry him. She will finally say yes. And the two will be married in Noank, Connecticut, at George Palmer Putnam's mother's house. And then on the day they got married, Amelia said to him, don't think I'm going to oblige or be constrained by any medieval conventions on marriage. She says, and I don't expect you to be either. And she also says, oh, by the way, I'm Amelia Earhart, now Amelia Earhart Putnam. The press is going to pick up on that one. George Palmer, not George Palmer Putnam, but George Palmer Earhart. And which won't go over too well. But that's okay. With the publicity, well, you know how this works with famous actors and heroes and so on and so forth. A line of luggage, pocketbooks, a line of clothes, AE. And those clothes are made to fit her slender figure. Lucky Strike cigarettes. And I often wondered if Edward Bernays had something to do with that. We're talking 1928, 29, 1930 here. How many here have ever heard of Edward Bernays? The father of American public relations, or propaganda? That's the term I like. And Edward Bernays comes out of the First World War. He helped sell the idea to Americans that World War I was fought for democracy. Well, he was hired by various cigarette companies. Liggett Meyer, L&M cigarettes. Lucky Strike bought him from L&M. That was George Washington Hill. And he's going to use women to sell cigarettes. And one of those, when he was selling Lucky Strike cigarettes, there was maybe you've seen this picture in some older history books. A woman, a pretty woman in a slinky red dress with a cigarette between 2 fingers with a faraway look like she's looking out a window. And since women got the right to vote in 1920, this is like 1928, the caption was called, relating to cigarettes, Torches of Freedom. So I often wondered whether Edward Bernays was instrumental in having Amelia Earhart sell Lucky Strike cigarettes. Amelia Earhart is also into, a big booster of air transport. Her, people like Charles Lindbergh. She also gets together with a Jean Vidal. Ever hear of him? General Jean Vidal, who is Gorby Vidal's father, the playwright. Gorby Vidal was born at West Point, Yeah, he was. His father taught him to fly when he was 10 years old. He soloed in a plane when he was 10 years old. It's on a Pathé newsreel. And Amelia Earhart, she's married to George Palmer Putnam, had an affinity for Jean Vidal. And as Gorby Vidal later stated, he said her marriage to George Palmer Putnam was a wretched marriage, because he was always pushing her into the limelight. And she, I guess, fell in love with Gorby Vidal's father. And Gorby Vidal's father liked her, and supposedly, according to Gorby Vidal, he told her, I like you, but I don't love you. And so she was involved in things like transcontinental air transport, which later becomes TWA. She was involved in the Ludington line, which was a local air service from New York City to Washington, D.C. and back. She will also be involved in another airline, which will eventually, in the Northeast sector here in New England, which will eventually become Northeast Airlines. Remember that one? I remember that as a kid. I used to fly out of Sikorsky Airport near Bridgeport. Yeah, I remember that airline. They had C-47s that said Northeast Airlines. Well, shows you how old I am, I guess. But she's involved. She's really pushing the envelope here for civilian air transport. She also becomes friends after the new administration takes office with Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt really liked her. In fact, there's a story that in 1934, when Amelia Earhart was visiting the White House and stayed overnight, her and Eleanor got all gussied up and snuck out of the White House for a night on the town. I don't think first ladies can do that anymore. Interesting aspect here too, that the day George Palmer Putnam and Amelia Earhart were married, there was no time for a honeymoon. She was on a 9-day swing across this country pushing an aircraft known as the autogyro. How many people are familiar with that one? Yeah, which is like an airplane with a almost, beg your pardon?
It's a helicopter, right?
Not quite. It's a rotary wing aircraft, but it needs a short runway to take off. And it will not really go over well in the end in this country. But Amelia Earhart will set an altitude record in a Pitcairn autogyro at 18,415 feet at one point. So she's on a 9-day swing just after getting married across this country, pushing the autogyro, sponsored in part by Lifesaver. Remember that? Remember the Lifesaver candies, or the breath mints, if that's what you want to call them? She's also going to cross this country. Should be the first female pilot to to fly cross country across this nation, forward and back. By 1934, she's also beginning long-range flights, especially into 1935. In fact, in January 1935, she will fly from Honolulu to Oakland. First flyer really to make that hop from Honolulu to Oakland. Into the spring of 1935, she will fly from Los Angeles to Mexico City. She will then turn around and fly from Mexico City to New York. She's getting into she's getting more and more into long-range flying here. And you know where that's going to get you. The idea of flying, circumnavigating the globe. She's also going to meet a gentleman here by the name of Paul Mantz. How many people have ever heard of him? He's an interesting character who will later meet up with a guy by the name of Frank Tallman. Tallman and Mantz were big in Hollywood movies, doing a lot of flying for Hollywood movies. In fact, you remember the movie The Flight of the Phoenix with Jimmy Stewart?
Oh, yeah.
The plane goes down in the desert.
Yeah.
Frank Tallman did some of the flying sequences for that. He will get killed during that movie. So the next time you watch that movie, which is a good movie, by the way, there's a credit at the end of that movie to the memory of Frank Tallman. In fact, Tallman and Mantz will be doing some of the flying sequences for that movie. It's a mad, 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 mad world. Yeah. And by this time, too, 1934, she's making these longer flights. The Palmer residence in New York, Rye, New York, burns. And so the two are going to go to California. George Palmer Putnam is going to sell his interest in G.P. Putnam Sons publishing company, and they'll move to California because George Palmer Putnam now has a job with Paramount Pictures. And so they will move to Toluca Lake in the middle of, Warner Brothers Studios, Paramount Studios, where a lot of the beautiful people live. And here she's beginning to foster that idea of a round-the-world flight. Not only will she get together with Paul Mantz, who owns a company called United Air Services. And so Amelia Earhart and Paul Mantz will open up a flying school, although it's really under the tutelage of Paul Mantz at this point. However, she also is going to foster a relationship with someone else, a man by the name of Harry Manning. Harry Manning is interesting in that he was the ocean liner captain when she left England in 1928 after first time crossing the Atlantic for the ride home. He not only is licensed as a captain and a maritime navigator, but as an aerial navigator. She will also foster a relationship with Fred Noonan, who was with her on the ill-fated flight. Noonan, by the way, is not only an aerial navigator, he's also a maritime navigator. So it seems like she's hooking up with some pretty good people here, competent people. Fred Noonan, by the way, is the man who was working at Pan Am. He was the one that charted most of those routes across the Pacific for the Pan Am Clippers and taught a lot of the navigators. She will be taken on by Purdue University. And it's Purdue that's going to foot some of the bill for the Lockheed Electra, the twin-engine Lockheed Electra, which is the plane she's going to use. And so at this point, the plane will be ready, and it's going to have extra gas tanks put into it. It's going to be a flying gas tank is what this plane's going to be. However, on March 17, 1937, and it's not just Fred Noonan and Amelia Earhart. It's Amelia Earhart, Fred Noonan, Paul Mance, and Harry Manning are all on the plane together. Manning, by the way, was supposed to navigate the plane from the coast to Hawaii. And it was going to be Fred Noonan who would navigate the plane from Hawaii to Howland Island. They're going in reverse. That was the initial trip, not the other way around. And so they will take off on March 17, 1937, from Oakland to Hawaii. That's the first leg. They have propeller hub problems when they're on Hawaii. That's going to have to be fixed before they continue the journey. As they're getting ready to take off to go to Howland Island from Hawaii, now some people who watched the takeoff said a tire blew. Amelia Earhart thought a landing gear strut gave out on the right side. Paul Mance later said it was pilot error. But the plane will dip on the wing and slide to a stop. Now there's aircraft damage. Can't continue the flight. The plane has to be shipped back to California for repairs. And so they are not going to leave until May of 1937. And Mance and Harry Manning will not be on the flight. It will be just Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan. They will leave in late May 1937. They will fly across the country to Miami. On June 1, 1937, they leave Miami for Puerto Rico and then South America. From Brazil, they will cross the South Atlantic to Africa. From Africa, they will fly to India, Karachi. From there, they will fly south, eventually winding up in Darwin, Australia, and finally leaving Australia for New Guinea, Lae, New Guinea. Lae, New Guinea was that last stop before Howland Island. Now keep in mind here, and this brings up Gorby Vidal again. You know, again, he was only like 12 years old at this point in 1937. And he's talking to Amelia Earhart before this flight. And he's looking at a map of the route with her. And he says, well, gee whiz, he says, I would think the Pacific is the most dangerous part of this flight. You know, all that ocean. And Amelia Earhart says, no. She says, I think Africa is, because if you go down in the jungle, who's going to find you? And she says, at least in the Pacific, you get all those islands. It's going to happen. You know, Gorby Vidal was funny, too. He really liked her. He didn't get along with his mother. And he always says, I wished my father had married Amelia Earhart. He says, I liked her better than my mother. So, but they're going to leave Lae, New Guinea, midnight, July 2, 1937, for Howland Island. Now, this is a 2,556-mile run. The longest leg of the 29,000-mile journey. Now, keep in mind, Howland Island is an island that's only 6,500 feet long, 1,600 feet wide. It's not a big spot in the Pacific, is it? Waiting there for them is a Coast Guard cutter named the Itasca. And when they take off, midnight, July 2nd, 1937, the runway they're taking off from Lae, New Guinea, is not a hard-surfaced runway. It's turf. Now keep in mind, the aircraft is heavily laden with fuel. And so since they're not on a hard surface, what do you think that plane's doing? Bouncing a little bit? They have a loop antenna underneath the plane. Now, some people who watched this said the antenna was ripped off. A search of the airfield didn't find an antenna. They also had a crank aerial. Now, if people are familiar with that, you go back to the First World War, when aircraft and radio really is in its infancy. You know, radios were not transistorized during the Great War. And so to save weight in some of these observation planes, you had one of two things, either a sender or receiver. Well, if you're an observation plane, what good's a receiver going to do you? So you have a sender. And it's usually telegraph. Keep in mind, these are open cockpit planes. You can't have voice. Who's going to hear you? And so you use the telegraph. But you cranked out the aerial to send the message. And the wire would go back into the slipstream, and that's your aerial. Then when you're done sending, you re-crank it. It's on a spool. She had the same sort of setup. Although it's later stated that her and Fred Noonan cut some of the wire so they wouldn't have to crank as much. Another problem. The radio and radio direction finding equipment on the Itasca is Navy equipment. They didn't have Navy equipment on the plane. And so not all the messages are going to be received between the two. And as they're flying along, Leo Ballarts is the radio operator on the Itasca. He's not able to get all the messages. And who knows if she got all of his messages. And so as the plane is flying along, and other stations are picking her up. That's interesting. Other stations are picking her up. And so as she closes in on Howland Island, you know, Ballard gets some of the messages, but he's not getting all of them. And so when at 8:15 in the morning is the last message that Ballard really gets. And they think she's over Howland Island at this point. The captain of the Itasca fires up the boilers. Going to leave a smoke trail. Maybe they'll see the smoke. Never shows up. And so the question of this day is, what happened to the plane? Where did it wind up? Some think it got to Gardner Island, which is like 330 miles south-southeast of Howland Island. There was no wreckage there. Although in 1940, folks, in 1940, a construction crew supposedly found the skeleton of a woman. Examination, it was a male, 5 foot 5 inches tall. David Putnam, George Palmer Putnam's son, one of his two sons, said they're 18,000 feet down. They pancaked in the drink. And so try finding the plane now. Then the stories come out. You know, she wound up as Tokyo Rose in Japan. That's one story that came out. Another story is they were captured by the Japanese in the Marianas. That's many miles to the north. Of course, not all that long ago, didn't a photograph come out showing her and Fred Noonan? I've seen that photograph from years ago, and you can't tell. Supposedly, too, according to eyewitnesses, they were both executed by the Japanese, flying as spies for the Roosevelt administration. Gorby Vidal, again, bring up Gorby Vidal, will ask Eleanor Roosevelt, when he gets to know her after the war, is there any truth to that story about Amelia Earhart flying as spies for the United States against the Japanese? And Eleanor Roosevelt's reply is, well, as you might expect, I had an investigation done, and that's just not true. That I'll leave to you to accept or reject. Another story. A man by the name of Joe Claas, Klaas, will write a book. It'll be published in 1970 about a woman, Irene Bolam, who supposedly looks like Amelia Earhart. who was actually a banker in New York City, retired. And class says that this is Amelia Earhart, which this lady vehemently denied. She will wind up going to court and suing for $1.5 million. And I think it was Harcourt, Brace and World that published this book. I think it was Harcourt Brace that published this book. That's a big publishing house. A bit like Random House. Those are big houses. They will lose in court. Yeah, wow is right. The book was yanked. Interesting if you find a copy of that book today. Interesting. Lawrence Safford, who was, if anyone knows about him from World War II, was one of the code breakers the Navy had in the Pacific, was asked to go over the radio direction finding, the notes, the communications, and his opinion after he's done investigating this, poor planning and even worse execution on the part of Earhart. And so what happened to Amelia Earhart? That's the thing about the Amelia Earhart story. There's no closure here. So what happened to her? You say.
Crabs.
Well, that's a big ocean, the Pacific. And keep in mind, even though the equipment back then is state of the art, can communication equipment then match what you have today? No, of course not. The Navy will detach the Colorado and the aircraft carrier Lexington and our escorts to conduct a search. The Navy will spend $4 million on this search. The most expensive sea search in American history by the Navy up to this point. George Palmer Putnam, the husband, will also finance a search, more than one. And that gets us to the other side of the story here. When someone goes missing, isn't there a 7-year waiting period here? Usually, when it comes to claiming assets, George Palmer Putnam will have her considered legally dead in 1939, so he can free up some of the assets to conduct these searches. And so to this day, nobody knows really what happened to her. Although, what is the long-term legacy here? I find this interesting that in World War II, what is the Army Air Force going to do? They're going to use women to fly planes from the United States to Greenland, to Iceland, to England, that shuttle run across the Atlantic. And some of these female aviators say, well, that's a legacy of what? Amelia Earhart. And that's interesting too, because some of those ladies really don't get their due in World War II. Interesting. Fascinating. Anybody have any questions or any comments? Yes, sir.
There's a lot of hard facts that were left out. The navigator refused to fly with her for one reason or another when they left Guam and Guinea. The radio, there was a large amount of static on the radio. They couldn't hear her. She's trying to talk on the radio because of the static. There was a thunder squall storm directly to the north of Guam, in the area of these Japanese held islands. Another fact, during World War II, a soldier walked through an airfield to go on to the next combat mission, saw an airplane in a hangar, later on positively identified as Amelia Earhart's, went into combat past the airfield, was wounded, as he was fighting, there was a huge fire behind him, somewhere in the rear. He came back, wounded, carrying him back. He saw the airplane burn with nothing left to it. Also, there were men in strange uniforms around the airplane. They were somewhat American, but he couldn't identify them. Another fact, it's a hard fact, an investigative reporter found her, Amelia Earhart. That's a hard fact. She said, "No, I am not Amelia Earhart." those investigative reporters are nasty people. They do a hard job. There's some other facts.
Yeah, they don't take no for an answer.
Well, before World War II started, Howard Hughes H-1 disappeared and the Japanese wound up with it. Plus another high-altitude fighter, the Japanese wound up with it. The Zero, they call it the Zero, was reworked into a super weapon, lasted right up until the end of the war.
Yeah, the A6M.
And it was the reworked version to a super weapon right until the end of the war. The high altitude version was used to attack B-29s. It was also used in the Coral Sea battle. Of course, the Japanese reworked that one also. There's a lot of hard facts, and it's nasty.
Well, it's interesting here because I have something here from a David Jordan, who is a former Navy submariner and an ocean engineer specializing in deep sea recoveries. He has claimed any transmissions attributed to the Gardner Island answer to the Amelia Earhart mystery were false. Through his company, Nauticos, he extensively searched a 1,200 square mile quadrant north and west of Howland Island during 2 deep-sea sonar expeditions in 2002 and 2006 at a cost of $4.5 million and found zip, nothing. He found nothing. Interesting. It's absolutely fascinating here. These different searches for her, and they come up empty. But then again, yeah, there was also the story on Saipan where the plane was, that the Japanese, when they captured it, cut it up and dumped it into the Pacific. And so, who's telling the truth here, or where's the ironclad proof that we know what happened to her in the end? Interesting, the different stories that are coming out of this. But then again, when you're dealing with human beings, aren't you going to get these wide variety of stories if there's nothing concrete? Yeah, of course you are. Of course you are. And again, you're probably going to see somewhere along the line some story on television. Well, we finally figured out the Amelia Earhart mystery. Yeah, okay. Yes.
It's interesting that the whole myth continues, though. It's very lively. It's not one that's forgotten.
No, it's not. No, it's not.
Even I wasn't kidding before. The other day, just yesterday, I read a article that she was fed by the Japanese to these 3-foot coconut crabs.
What?
Has anybody seen that article?
I mean the land crabs?
Yes. They crack. They're so strong they can crack coconuts open.
Oh.
Yeah. Well, the Marines and GIs around those islands know about those things.
Yeah. Well.
I mean, talk to some of those guys around those
This
islands.
was just yesterday that this article came out. I read it.
Yeah.
And so it's, it still has an active, pops up every, month or two,
But I mean, the stories that abound here. Why? Because out of these ladies we've been talking about, she's the only one where there's no closure. If you think about it in that respect. So in that, they're all unique, but this helps make Amelia Earhart even more unique. There's no closure here. Somebody had their hand up. Yes.
Yeah, we weren't at war in 1937. That's
No.
why I don't understand this. They say the Japanese did this and they did that. We weren't even at war with Japan.
In fact, the Japanese will join in searching for her. And while the United States is out there, they'll join. They'll send 2 ships.
Well, you have to blame somebody.
Well, yeah, there's always that penchant for that. Yeah, I'll give you that. I'll give you that. There's always that penchant for that. But then again, it's you're seeing the build-up toward war at this point anyway. I mean, 1937, the Japanese invade China proper, in July, and that's the same month. They invade China July 7. It's only 5 days earlier that Amelia Earhart took off from New Guinea to go to Howland Island. And so, the search now is in full swing by now. But yeah, the Japanese invaded China July 7, 1937. So, the war is coming closer to the United States at this point. And so, yeah, it's the build-up toward war. Yes.
I've seen brief references to the female aviators during World War II. Is there one book out there addressing that subject broadly?
In fact, someone just gave me a book, and it's about female aviators in the Third Reich.
There's a Russian, there were Russian female pilots too.
The Russians were the ones who fielded.
There's a book on them.
There were at least two or three at least in the Red Air Force squadrons that were completely manned by women,
One of them
and they saw combat.
Ace, one of them, I can't remember her name.
In fact,
Shot down a lot of planes.
In fact, by the end of 42, going into 1943, half the anti-aircraft gunners in the Soviet Union were women.
Wow.
They needed men at the front. Now, they're losing bodies like they're going out of style, so they need men at the front. So the women have to take up the slack someplace. Plus, the women were working in the factories like they were here anyway. And so, yeah. And so so when you look at women in this light, and then look at people like Amelia Earhart, are women becoming more accepted? And yeah, they are. You know, it's people like Susan B. Anthony, Helen Keller, Amelia Earhart, and then next 3 weeks it's Eleanor Roosevelt. Yeah, I mean the society's changing, culture is changing, and women are changing here. You know, they're becoming more and more accepted on the world scene, and that has to be, modern society. And so women are taking their place here in a variety of venues, and aviation is one of them. So. And it's not just Amelia Earhart, it's people like Jacqueline Cochran, who was an excellent aviator in her own right, and yet, again, going back to the press, they were trying to say that her and Amelia were rivals. They were pretty good friends, by the way. So,
There was another female pilot, Babe something, you called it.
Yeah.
They had a race from like Texas to Ohio, I think it was.
Well, there was that women's air derby in 1934 from Santa Monica to Cleveland.
That's what I'm thinking of, yeah.
And at that time, you still had the Cleveland Air Races. It was the Cleveland Air Races, and women weren't allowed. And so Amelia Earhart was supposed to, they asked Amelia Earhart to fly in Mary Pickford to start the races. And she says, get another chauffeur. If we're not going to allow women to compete, you get another chauffeur. I'm not flying Pickford to that.
America's sweetheart.
Yeah, America's sweetheart, yeah, she wouldn't do it. She wouldn't do it. No, it was the Bendix Cup. Yeah, the Bendix Cup. She wouldn't do it. 1935, 1934, she wouldn't do it. 35, I think women were allowed to fly in it. But up to that point, no, we don't want women flying in this. And so Amelia says, get yourself another chauffeur. I'm not doing it. So I guess they had to. Who took her place, I don't know, but I know that's what Amelia said, get yourself another chauffeur. I'm not doing it. She was very much into, she was also a supporter of the Equal Rights Amendment. So she was very much, and this was a lady too. Now it's interesting going back into her earlier life. This was a lady who used to keep a scrapbook as a young lady. I'm talking a child and a teenager, on women who really made a name for themselves in what was considered male-dominated endeavors at the time, like photography, filmmaking, law, so on and so forth. Interesting. Interesting what you see in this young lady as a young girl and as a teenager, keeping a scrapbook of women who made real inroads in the male-dominated endeavors. Interesting. Yeah. Wow. Of course, she's going to have a short life, but she made a name for herself. So. Anybody else have any questions or comments?
Did she have children?
No. Well, two adopted children, if you want to call George Palmer Putnam Jr. and David Putnam as her stepchildren. But maybe that was part of that letter she wrote to her husband saying, I'm not going to be tied to any medieval conventions on marriage. Oh, and by the way, I'm Amelia Earhart, not Amelia Earhart Putnam.
Mark, did you see the recent movie about Amelia Earhart with the actress who played in the boxing movie, the Clint Eastwood.
No, really. There was a movie. There was a movie made in 1943. In fact, I think I have that in my notes here. There was a movie made in 1943. And it was Rosalind Russell and Fred McMurray.
Yeah.
You remember that? I haven't seen that in years. But they were supposed to be reminiscent of Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan. So, 1943, during the war.
Did Fred Noonan drink a little bit? Was there,
Yeah, he liked to imbibe in vitamins G, I, and N.
They had arguments at times about what they were going to do and how to go about doing
Well, I
it.
guess when he was sober enough to be cognizant about these arguments, I guess. Yeah, he was known to tip the arm, tip the elbow. Yeah. But this was a man who had the reputation of having charted all those Pan Am Clipper routes in the Pacific. Which you can't be a moron and do that. You have to know what you're doing. I mean, that's long-range flying across the Pacific then.
What was it, 2,100 miles? Was that the last leg? The
2,556 miles from Lae, New Guinea to Howland Island.
What was the depth of the ocean around there? Does anyone know?
Well, the way the figures are bandied about here, they're talking 17, 18,000 feet. And so also another ocean, I think it was an oceanographer, said that, who goes after looking for, planes and ships that have been shipwrecked or sunk or whatever the case may be. He says, we're not talking about a ship, we're talking about a plane. And he says, by now, maybe that thing's dissolved. So. Well, that's it. I mean, you have to have a place to, look what happened to that airliner several years ago. Remember that?
And that was huge.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, compared to that Lockheed Electra was a fly. And so, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, but again, the Pacific is a huge, huge ocean, and it's deep. Like the Mindanao Deep. Yeah. I mean, when you talk history and you talk about shipwrecks, you talk about the sinking of Lusitania, which I did a couple weeks ago, and that's really not all that deep. But then when you talk about going for the Yorktown off Midway, yeah, big difference there. Big difference there. Yes. Oh, I thought you had your hand up.
No.
Oh, all right. All right. Anybody else have any comments or
You don't think that
questions?
photograph that came to surface about last fall has any validity?
I don't know. I'm not going to say for sure. I mean, does it maybe look like her? Maybe.
Well, they did comparisons,
It's a fact,
her height
isn't it?
and
Right.
her and Fred,
Yeah,
and the plane even looked like the plane.
it did. But to say that with 100% certainty, nope. I mean, all you have to do is look at what some people can do with a photograph. I mean, the example here, I guess, is the Loch Ness Monster, that famous photograph of the head and the neck going, yeah. That was proved to be false, at least supposedly.
Yeah.
So it's interesting here what you can do with a photograph if you know what you're doing.
Why would somebody go through all that trouble to do that?
They like doing it. They want to fool people.
Money, right?
Notoriety.
Money?
Money, notoriety, I guess. Who knows? But again, unless it's really proven, I'll have my doubts. Because we really don't know. It's an open question here. Although I don't think she was a Tokyo Rose, though. I don't believe that. Yes, sir.
The Loch Ness Monster was photographed by satellite. I know as much as you do about it, but that was on the news. It was photographed by a satellite.
Yeah, well, that other photograph came out in 1937, I think it was.
Was that the beaver or the weasel thing with his arm? Or they thought that
Yeah.
it turned out to be a small animal.
Or was the other photograph, too, with the humps in the water? I saw that one, too. Yeah.
I don't believe in that.
Yeah, well, Anyway. Now we're getting back into 1950s sci-fi flicks. Beast from 20,000 fathoms. Anybody else have any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Mark, can you tell us about your future plans for a series of talks, maybe next year, or what you're in the planning stages of now?
Oh, I already sent 3 in.
3,
3 series to do
3 different.
for them to
series.
pick from.
For here, you mean, or just
Oh, yeah.
all over?
Yeah.
Can you give the subjects?
Yeah, I'll give them. One of them is the Nazi Revolution from 1919, 1934. I just finished that over in Fairfield. The other one is the Russian Revolution, and it's the 100th anniversary of that. Russian Revolution and the Civil War. And the other one is War Leaders, and that is a series of 4 people: Winston Churchill, Adolf Hitler, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin. Yeah. Uncle Joe. And you notice Uncle Joe is last. So it depends what they want to do. Depends what they want. Because in the Nazi Revolution, when everyone talks about Nazi Germany, it's always 1933-45. Well, what happened in 1919, 1934? You know, the rise of the Nazis.
Oh, the beer puts.
Yeah, the beer hall put, right, the Munich, November 1923. And, you know, what happened to the Weimar Republic? What happened to the SA?
How come, real quick, how come they treated Hitler like, when he went to jail that time, like he was, they didn't treat him like a prisoner, they treated him with royalty.
Well, yeah, he could have got 5 years, he got 9 months. And that's where he's going to write Mein Kampf. But keep in mind, a lot of the German judiciary establishment was right wing. And you're not going to come down on if he was a leftist. Oh yeah, he would have been nailed to the cross. But he's a rightist, so they're not going to come down hard on him. And so that's that's the reality in Germany at that point. Interesting what you see there. Yes.
I saw a photograph of Borman in a Volkswagen plant in Brazil, southern Brazil. He was a big Nazi, second only to Hitler in the Nazi party. Borman, his name was.
Yeah, Martin Bormann.
He worked living under his own name, and he was photographed inside a Volkswagen plant in southern Brazil. Everyone thought the Volkswagen came from Germany. It came from South America. I'm making a wild guess. The Nazi party brought it down to South America, and it's actually a South American German car. The Nazi party was involved in it.
Well, part of that was that pipeline of getting escaped Nazis out of Europe to South America. And part of that was with the Vatican during the war. And, some of these Nazis are going to get their comeuppance, some will not. Bormann was alleged to have escaped from Berlin as the Russians were closing in. Now, some say he got killed, some say he didn't. But there has never been again, that's another one, there's never been a finality to this. And so, the mystery, of course, he's probably dead by now, I would assume. But yeah, that's, but again, when we talk about Nazi Germany, it's usually 1933, 1945. And in that series, I always bring out a man by the name of Ernst Room, who, nobody talks about Ernst Room, and yet he's instrumental in Hitler's rise to power. He was the chief of the SA, the stormtroopers. And he's a fascinating character. Was a notorious homosexual by the time he was age 25. And, but he was a tough guy, tough guy. And he's one of the few, he's about the only person that was allowed to call Hitler Adolf. So it gives you an idea of the relationship they had. So, interesting character, Room. And he gets lost in the shuffle. So. And then the Russian Revolution, and then the War Leaders. So it depends what they want to do.
The Stage is another one that was open for a while. Remember there was, where's the Tsar's daughter? Did she make it to America? There was all sorts of rumors of that going on.
Well, yeah, but it's more or less assumed here that the whole family got wiped out in that cellar.
Right.
In July 1918.
Supposedly
The Bolsheviks.
Put him on the truck and she jumped off, and
Oh, the bodies were all dead they were all dead by then.
I don't know,
They were either shot or bayoneted at that point. That included the kids.
multiple times.
Right. Right. Which Lenin didn't order. That was done on their own. Because the Czech Legion was closing in, so they figured, well, maybe they're there to liberate the Tsar, and we've come all this way. We got to get rid of them. Da-da-da-da-da-da. So, got rid of them. Well, yeah, it's not, yeah. Well, the same thing happened to the royal family in Iraq in the 1958 revolution there. Almost the whole family got it. The royal family got it. King Faisal II and his family. Whoosh. So, and you saw that in the French Revolution, too. Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI. And so supposedly, of course, in that case, the French revolutionaries stuck them on the guillotine face up to watch the blade come down.
Face up?
Yeah. Yep. So, nice people. Anyway.
Mr. Sunshine.
Yeah, Mr. Sunshine.
Supposedly, some of the heads, like chickens, supposedly they had consciousness for a few minutes afterwards. Looking around and wondering what's going on. But
Yeah. But anyway, Amelia Earhart, I mean, there's no closure here, so the story persists. And until there's something concrete, this is what happened to them. The stories will persist.
Do you think they can use DNA in the future or something like that?
If they can find the bodies, or something.
didn't they find a finger somewhere?
They found a skull on Gardner. They found a body on Gardner Island, but it wasn't a woman's body. It was supposedly a male at 5 foot 5 inches tall, supposedly. But again, there's nothing here to.
I think this is going to be.
Well, I think the Putnam boys are right. I think they're 18,000 feet down, so we're spinning our wheels here in the sand. So, well, that's of course that's what people like, but it's maybe not gonna happen here. I mean, it's just the mystery itself that attracts people here. Right. So, like the Martin Borman story, that attracts people. So, anyway. Otherwise, that's it. Have a good evening. Thank you.